They're all hearts. I, the defendant, repeatedly violated the court's order.
The courtroom fell silent, then erupted. A laugh, sharp and dismissive, cut through the air like the crack of a gavel. It wasn't the sound of joy, but of mockery, rolling off the bench where Judge Andrew H. Stone sat towering above the chamber. For a split second, no one dared move. Then came the gasp, one, then another, cascading through the gallery like the ripple of a dropped stone in still water. Even the stenographer's hands hovered above the keys, frozen in disbelief. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of every eye now fastened to her, as though the whole room had conspired to see whether she would shrink or rise. The judge's laughter lingered, cruel and unrestrained, echoing against the paneled walls until it seemed larger than the man himself. Why does this matter? Because one laugh can unravel an entire reputation. Authority isn't cemented by robes or titles, it's held together by dignity. And in that instant, with one careless burst of derision, a judge revealed not power but fragility. Whispers rippled along the wooden benches, hushed voices darting like sparks. Did he really just laugh? Some shook their heads, others smirked, as if savoring the drama unfolding before them. It was no longer a routine proceeding. It was theater, with every audience member waiting for the next line. Crockett's stillness was its own performance. She was measured, almost statuesque, but beneath that composure pulsed a storm. The gallery couldn't see it, but they could feel it. The tension of someone deciding, in real time, whether to remain silent or to strike back. The laugh had been meant to belittle, to shrink her presence into nothingness, but instead it magnified her, casting her as the figure the entire room couldn't look away from. And then, nothing. A pause, longer than comfort allowed. Judge Stone smirked, certain he'd delivered the final word without ever speaking one. The moment hung suspended, fragile as glass. Nobody in that room expected what Jasmine Crockett would do next. This wasn't just a courtroom clash. It was a parable about power, who wields it, who resists it, and who gets to define the meaning of respect. What happened between Judge Andrew H. Stone's and Jasmine Crockett became more than a fleeting exchange. It became a mirror, held up for the nation to see authority stripped bare. In that room, a laugh wasn't simply a sound. It was a weapon. It carried the weight of hierarchy, of centuries of robes and benches, of gavel strikes that silenced voices without explanation. When Stones let it slip, it wasn't just directed at Crockett. It was directed at the very idea that someone like her could stand unshaken in the face of establishment authority. Yet there she stood, composed, dignified, immovable. Crockett represented something larger than herself. Her resilience didn't flare with anger or crumble into silence. It hovered in the balance, a calm resistance that unsettled far more than outrage ever could. The stakes weren't confined to those four walls. Within minutes, the moment leaped from courtroom to culture. Twitter lit up with clips replayed in grainy loops, Stones leaning back, shoulders shaking with laughter, while Crockett remained still as stone. TikTok flooded with edits, slow motion, captions, reaction overlays. Was this bias or raw ego laid bare? Comment threads split open, strangers arguing as though they had been in the gallery themselves. Every share, every repost, magnified the imbalance. On one side, institutional arrogance wearing the mask of tradition. On the other, a steady composure refusing to yield. People didn't just see Crockett. They saw themselves in her shoes, confronted with authority that belittles rather than upholds. And that was the tension. A judge's robe granting him status, a smirk suggesting immunity, yet an unspoken truth cracking through. Authority without humility becomes fragile. It can be undone not with rage but with silence. And Crockett's silence was deafening. The imbalance was almost theatrical. Stones towered from the bench, elevated both literally and symbolically, looking down as though control was his birthright. Crockett, standing below, seemed smaller in scale but larger in presence, her every breath reminding the room that dignity has its own gravity. The courtroom's gallery leaned forward, compelled not just by spectacle, but by recognition. Everyone had felt it before. The sting of being dismissed, the sharp edge of laughter wielded as a blade. They weren't just watching her moment, they were reliving their own. That empathy fused the audience together, inside the courtroom and far beyond its doors. It was no longer about law. It was about narrative. Who defines the scene, the man laughing from power, or the woman holding ground beneath it? Who decides what respect looks like? These questions pulsed through the chamber like a second heartbeat, felt but unspoken, demanding answers in real time. The silence that followed Stone's laugh wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of shifting weight. Every second that Crockett didn't move, didn't flinch, pressed harder against the brittle authority of the bench. The imbalance remained, but the perception tilted. Viewers didn't see fragility in Crockett's stance, they saw strength sharpened by restraint. And so the clash transformed. It wasn't just arrogance versus composure, it was authority itself on trial, measured not by statutes but by dignity. But to see why Crockett's answer mattered, you need to know who was sitting on that bench. Judge Andrew H. Stones was never a man of whispers. His reputation preceded him into every chamber he entered. Sharp tongue, clipped sentences, a gaze that turned hesitation into humiliation. For years, his courtroom had been a stage where he reigned unchallenged, dispensing verdicts with an air of inevitability. Lawyers whispered that Stones didn't just interpret the law, he performed it, his authority wrapped in sarcasm as much as precedent. Beneath the robe, bias often flickered like a shadow he couldn't quite hide. He carried it in the tilt of his chin, in the subtle scoff before a ruling, in the way his voice could flatten an argument before it even found air. Those who faced him learned quickly, it wasn't just about evidence or statute, it was about whether you survived the performance intact. Irony stalked him that day. The man who prided himself on dignity, caught chuckling in open court. A laugh that stripped the robe of its gravitas, reducing centuries of judicial solemnity into something closer to the jeers of a heckler at the back of a bar. It wasn't clever, it wasn't commanding, it was petty. And that hypocrisy mattered. A judge is supposed to embody restraint, to transform personal opinion into measured fairness. But Stones revealed something else: authority corroded by ego. His laugh carried no legal weight, yet it shook the courtroom more than any ruling he had ever delivered. For once, the mask slipped, and the performance cracked. He believed his smirk was untouchable, a gesture that would dissolve without consequence. He never imagined it would become the very thing that defined him. And across from him sat the one voice he underestimated. Jasmine Crockett's path had never been smooth. Long before she stood in that courtroom, she was a figure others dismissed, a voice many tried to talk over. Cable news pundits mocked her tone, her questions, her refusal to shrink when cornered. Opponents in debates treated her as if she were ornamental, never central, until she dismantled their talking points with the precision of a scalpel. Each slight, each interruption left a mark, but not the kind that weakens. They became scars she wore like armor. She learned early that composure was its own weapon. In rooms where volume was mistaken for authority, she discovered the power of silence, the potency of stillness. When her critics leaned in to sneer, she leaned back into patience, forcing them to exhaust themselves in their own arrogance. That was her discipline, her resilience, born not from comfort but from constant underestimation. In Crockett, humility wasn't passivity. It was resolve, sharpened by every attempt to sideline her. She carried dignity like a shield, refusing to let mockery define her worth. Each storm she endured prepared her for the next, each dismissal refined her ability to stand straighter when the world expected her to bow. So when Stones laughed, it wasn't the first time she'd been reduced to a punchline. But it was the most public. The smirk from the bench, the echoing chuckle, it wasn't just arrogance. It was the embodiment of every room that had tried to shrink her before. The contrast couldn't have been starker: his smug laughter, her steady breath. His authority rooted in status, hers in unshakable presence. And when the laughter came, the escalation was instant. It began not with thunder but with a smirk. Stones leaned back, lips curling in that half-smile that was never truly humor, always something sharper, a blade disguised as amusement. The laugh slipped out, short at first, then fuller, spreading across the courtroom with an authority that demanded others join in or remain uncomfortably silent. Crockett didn't flinch. She stood there, still as if carved in marble, every second of her pause magnifying the sound until it seemed absurdly loud. That silence, hers not his, turned the spotlight. The gallery, restless, shifted in their seats. Some coughed, others whispered, a few let out nervous chuckles of their own, unsure whether to treat it as comedy or cruelty. For Stones, it was theater. His eyes swept the room as if to say, "See, I've put her in her place." His posture carried the casual arrogance of someone certain the moment was his. And then, as if sealing the humiliation, he waved a hand lightly, dismissively, murmuring, Don't take it so seriously. Just a joke. But the phrase landed heavier than any ruling. Just a joke. That was the gaslight, the attempt to reframe mockery as harmless banter. Yet everyone in the room had felt the sting. It wasn't harmless, it was meant to diminish. Crockett's pause made that truth unavoidable. The escalation wasn't loud, but it was steady. Every eye shifted from the judge's grin to Crockett's silence. The balance tilted, not in words but in perception. She didn't need to answer yet, her stillness was already exposing the imbalance. And outside the courtroom, the ripple began. A spectator's phone buzzed, another leaned down to send a hurried text, "You won't believe what just happened." By the time the proceeding limped forward, the moment had already broken free. Twitter clipped the laugh, looping it endlessly. TikTok users slowed it down, zoomed in on Stone's shaking shoulders, overlaying captions like, "The laugh heard round the court." Memes sprouted overnight, a judge's smirk pasted over cartoon villains, his chuckle remixed into dance tracks. "Laughing judge" trended within hours. The world had taken a single sound and turned it into spectacle, and with each share, the meaning twisted further out of Stone's control. What he framed as a joke became an emblem of arrogance. What he thought would fade lingered louder than ever. Inside, the pressure built. Crockett knew all eyes were waiting. Some expected her to snap, to lash out, to match his derision with fire. Others feared she might fold, the humiliation swallowing her into silence. But she chose neither. She chose patience, letting the weight of the room grow heavier with each second of composure. The judge leaned forward again, tapping his pen against the desk as though impatient for her response. The tapping, rhythmic and insistent, was his attempt to seize back control. But even that fell flat, swallowed by the awareness that the power in the room had already begun to shift. Those watching, inside the gallery and across millions of screens, held their breath. This was no longer about the laugh itself. It was about what came after. Would Crockett bend beneath the performance? Or would she do something none of them expected? Every pause, every deliberate breath, stretched the suspense further. And Stone's, growing uneasy, masked it with another grin, trying to laugh again, trying to prove the moment still belonged to him. But repetition only weakened it. The second chuckle sounded forced, the smirk strained. Authority, once assumed, now trembled on fragile ground. Crockett hadn't spoken a word, yet she was already winning. Dignity has its own gravity, and hers pulled the focus inexorably toward her. The gallery could sense it, the audience online amplified it, and even Stone's, though he wouldn't admit it, felt it in the tightening of his jaw, in the way his laughter began to echo hollow against the walls. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The shift from silence to sound, the instant when composure sharpens into precision. Because her comeback wasn't loud, it was surgical. The pause ended not with volume but with clarity. Crockett drew in a breath so quiet it seemed meant only for herself, and then, without raising her voice, she began. Her tone was measured, each word laid down like a stone in a path, deliberate and unshakable. "Your Honor," she said, her eyes steady, "is dignity now something we laugh at?" It wasn't anger that struck the room but precision. The question landed sharper than any shout could have, stripping the chuckle of its disguise. The gallery stiffened, their eyes flicking from her to Stone's, waiting for him to reclaim the ground he thought he had secured. But his smirk faltered, just slightly. The first crack in what had seemed like unshakable performance. She didn't stop there. With calm precision, she dismantled his posture piece by piece. A judge's robe represents more than one person. It represents the idea that justice stands taller than pride. When you laugh in open court, who exactly are you laughing at? Me, this case. Or the people who expect fairness from this bench? A gasp rippled. The irony, once hidden, now blazed in the open. Stones had mocked not just an attorney, but the very principle he was sworn to uphold. His laughter, intended to diminish, now revealed hypocrisy too glaring to ignore. Crockett layered her words with a subtle edge of irony, each phrase slipping the knife in deeper. Perhaps it's easy to confuse mockery with authority. Perhaps it feels good for a moment to sit above others and let a laugh replace an argument. But what happens when people stop laughing with you and start laughing at you? The gallery stirred. A few in the back couldn't suppress murmurs of agreement. Onlookers who moments ago had been silenced by hierarchy now leaned forward, energized by the reversal. Stones tried to cut in, his voice forced and brittle. "Counsel, you're out of..." But Crockett didn't raise her tone. She simply overrode him with steadiness. Out of line. No, Your Honor. I am exactly in line with the expectation that dignity belongs here, in this courtroom, not derision. The words hit like a gavel. Stone's interruption collapsed beneath them. His authority, once assumed, was now contested and faltering. Online, the moment was already detonating. Clips of Crockett's calm dismantling flooded feeds. Twitter captions read, "She flipped the laugh back on him," and the silence before this was legendary. TikTok loops paired her line with dramatic music. Replaying the instant Stone's smirk began to falter. Every share magnified her precision, turning what he thought would vanish into a permanent stain. Inside the room, tension climbed higher. Crockett didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She knew the power wasn't in shouting but in letting Stone's unravel himself. Every second he sat silent became proof of the imbalance now exposed. Then came the cascading turns. One after another, each sharper than the last. She pressed the contradiction further. Respect is not a privilege granted at the bench's discretion. Respect is the baseline. When you laugh at counsel, you laugh at process. When you dismiss dignity as a joke, you dismiss the law itself. Gasps again. A murmur ran through the gallery like a current. Even the stenographer, pen trembling, seemed to hesitate before recording each word, as though aware these lines would outlive the proceeding. Stones leaned forward, gripping his pen, knuckles pale. His attempt at composure betrayed unease. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, the laugh now lodged in his throat like a stone too heavy to swallow. Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. Power does not excuse arrogance. It magnifies responsibility. If justice cannot be trusted to keep its own dignity, then why should anyone trust its rulings? The silence that followed was not empty. It was suffocating. Stones shifted in his chair, his robe suddenly less like a symbol of honor and more like a costume he could no longer wear convincingly. Online reaction mirrored the chamber's electricity. Memes split the screen, Stones laughing on one side, Crockett's piercing stare on the other. Captions screamed, "Who's laughing now?" The clip became more than viral. It became iconic, a digital monument to a single reversal. And still, Crockett pressed on, each line a quiet strike. Your Honor, perhaps laughter feels safe from the bench. But outside these walls, laughter is replayed, dissected, remembered. The public may forgive mistakes, but they rarely forgive contempt. The irony was complete. The man who prided himself on dignity had reduced himself to a punchline. And Crockett, by refusing to shout, by wielding restraint as a weapon, had rewritten the script. Every attempt he made to recover, to clear his throat, to shuffle papers, to signal control, only underscored the imbalance. His authority shrank with every gesture, while hers expanded with every word. The gallery sat on edge, half in awe, half in disbelief at the shift they were witnessing. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling, a methodical unmasking of arrogance dressed as power. And then came the final blow, the line that crystallized everything, the one that lifted her calm into legend. Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice soft enough to force the room to strain for it, yet sharp enough to cut through the air like glass. Respect, Your Honor, isn't something you can laugh away. It's something you either uphold or you lose. Gasps erupted. A murmur swept the benches, disbelief crashing into exhilaration. Stones froze, his lips parting but no words following. For the first time, the gavel in his hand seemed like dead weight, an ornament with no authority behind it. The reversal was complete. A single laugh had triggered the unraveling, but Crockett's composure had carried it to its inevitable conclusion, authority undone not by rage, but by precision. And yet, the moment wasn't finished. The room, the audience, the world leaned forward, waiting. Because after all the strikes, all the dismantling, all the irony laid bare. And then came the line that stopped the judge cold. The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever known. Moments earlier, laughter had filled the air, a sound meant to diminish. Now that same air felt weighted, thick with the reversal no one could deny. Crockett's line lingered like smoke, impossible to wave away. Respect, she had declared, wasn't his to laugh off, and the echo of that truth still hung heavy above the bench. Stones froze. His eyes darted across the gallery, searching for validation, for some sign that the room was still his to command. But he found none. The chuckles he expected had died before they began, replaced with the brittle quiet of a crowd caught between awe and disbelief. Arrogance had dissolved into humiliation, and everyone could see it. Crockett didn't move. She didn't need to. Her stillness became its own gravity, pulling the energy of the room toward her. What Stones thought was control had slipped from his grasp, redirected into her composure. Each second of silence was an indictment, a reminder that laughter had cost him more than words could repair. The ideological ripple was immediate. For years, courtroom decorum had been defined by a one-way street. Respect flowed upward unquestioned, demanded by those in robes. But tonight that hierarchy wavered. Crockett's calm precision had reset the balance. She hadn't shouted, hadn't begged, hadn't deferred. She had demanded that dignity apply in both directions, that authority be held to the same standard it imposed. The gallery knew it, felt it, breathed it in. Even outside the chamber, the shift was electric. Phones buzzed with live updates, the clip already breaking into feeds. Hashtags like Pay Crockett Clapback and Fi Stone Silent surged before the stenographer had even finished her notes. Twitter debated whether a judge's authority should shield him from such exposure, but the consensus was clear: the laugh had cost him dearly, and Crockett had collected the debt. Inside, the reversal deepened. Every tick of the clock pressed heavier on Stones. His robe, once an emblem of untouchable stature, seemed to shrink against him. He tried to compose himself, to raise the gavel and reassert order, but the gesture rang hollow. Authority was no longer assumed, it had to be earned, and he had spent his in a single smirk. Crockett's restraint became the story. Her refusal to gloat, to exploit the moment, magnified its weight. By holding silence, she allowed Stones to sit in his own undoing, forced him to confront the contradiction he embodied. He had mocked dignity, and in doing so, forfeited his own. The gallery whispered in bursts, the kind of murmurs that carry judgment in their tone. It wasn't just Crockett they admired. It was the principle she represented. The quiet dignity of someone refusing to bow to condescension. The strength of turning arrogance into its own collapse. Every look, every sideways glance toward Stones, testified to the same truth: respect had changed hands. And then, at last, the gavel fell. The crack against wood was sharp, a desperate attempt to reassert dominance. But even that sound failed to land as intended. Instead of restoring order, it punctuated his defeat. The crowd didn't hear authority in that strike, they heard retreat, an echo of desperation wrapped in formality. The legal proceeding continued, but the real verdict had already been rendered. It wasn't written in transcripts or delivered in rulings. It was etched in the silence that followed her words, in the hashtags burning across screens, in the humiliation etched into his face. When the gavel finally struck, the real verdict wasn't legal, it was moral. The echo of that gavel didn't erase what had already unfolded, it only underscored the fallout. By the time Stones left the bench, his shoulders stiff, his gaze fixed anywhere but the crowd, the damage was already irreversible. What he thought was a passing laugh had etched itself into memory, a crack across the marble facade of his reputation. For years, Stones had cultivated an image of command. He was the man whose word carried the weight of law, whose courtroom demeanor demanded respect without question. But all it took was one slip of arrogance, one smirk too wide, one chuckle too loud, and the mask fractured. The robe no longer looked untouchable, it looked human, fragile, and deeply flawed. Meanwhile, Crockett's stock soared. Her restraint became legend before the session even adjourned. Commentators marveled at her poise, replaying the moment of silence where she stood steady against laughter meant to diminish her. That pause, longer than any speech, told a story the world was hungry to hear. Calm can crush chaos, dignity can disarm ego, and one measured response can tilt the scales of perception. The audience took more than entertainment from the clash, they took a lesson. Arrogance isn't invincible, it's combustible. When met with composure, it burns itself out. Crockett had proven it, not by shouting louder or wielding sharper insults, but by embodying the very principle her opponent mocked. In doing so, she exposed the fragility of ego when tested by grace, and across the digital sphere, the verdict rang clear. Stones was the judge, but Crockett had been the one to pass judgment. Viral clips carried captions like, "Dignity wins," and "Respect served cold." TikTok spliced her stillness against his laughter, side by side, a split-screen masterclass in contrasts. One figure shrinking beneath his own pride, the other rising in silence. The emotional payoff was universal. Viewers who had tasted humiliation in their own lives felt vindicated watching her quiet resilience turn the tide. Those who had ever been laughed at, underestimated, or dismissed saw themselves reflected in Crockett's composure. It wasn't just her victory, it was theirs too. By nightfall, the story had escaped the courtroom and settled into public consciousness. Opinion columns framed it as a clash of values authority without humility versus strength anchored in dignity. Talk shows replayed the laugh like evidence in a trial, each replay cementing how far Stones had fallen. His authority survived in law, perhaps, but not in legacy. And so, one laugh reshaped reputations. One smirk rewrote a narrative. The balance of power, long tilted toward the robe, shifted in the span of a heartbeat, and the world had witnessed it live. Yet as the dust settled, a lingering question hovered in the air, one that even Crockett couldn't answer: what happens next time? Judge Stones laughed, but Jasmine's cold response is what the world remembers. The smirk that was meant to belittle instead became the spark that flipped a courtroom, a career, and perhaps even a legacy. One moment of arrogance, undone by one moment of composure. And now the verdict isn't just his, it belongs to everyone who watched. If you were in that courtroom, whose side would you have been on? Were you with the robe, leaning on authority without humility? Or were you with Crockett, proving that silence can be sharper than any gavel? Drop your take in the comments below. This story isn't finished until your voice is part of it. And if you believe that calm will always crush chaos, hit subscribe, because this channel is where dignity stands its ground, no matter how loud the laughter. But don't mistake this as a closed case, because if a single laugh can collapse a judge's crown, what happens in the next viral moment? Whose arrogance will the world expose next, and whose composure will carry the day? Stay tuned.